In September 1944, major battles were fought in the Carpathian region to assist the Slovak national uprising. The 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps took part in the battles together with the Soviet Army. It was the biggest battle in the history of the Czechoslovak Army. The nationwide character that the Slovak national uprising acquired in the course of its development created favourable conditions for seeking help from the Soviet Union. Clement Gottwald's request was conveyed by Ambassador Zdeněk Ferninger on 31 August 1944, and already on 2 September the Soviet government granted the request. The only effective solution to the question of aid was the decision for Soviet units to enter Slovakia and to penetrate quickly into the territory engulfed by the uprising. Only this kind of assistance could at once and in the shortest possible time decisively change the balance of forces in favour of the insurgents. However, this meant penetrating into Slovakia by a blow through the Carpathians. No commander worthy of this high rank would dare to storm such a gigantic mountain barrier as the mighty Carpathian rampart without extremely serious reasons. And the Soviet Supreme High Command, of course, did not plan such an operation. On the contrary, it wanted to leave the entire German defence system inside the Carpathians and liberate the territory of Slovakia and Moravia by covering it with giant pincers from the north with a blow to Krakow, Ostrava, and from the south by advancing towards Budapest, Bratislava, Brno. However, when the Slovak national uprising broke out unexpectedly, the Soviet government had to decide quickly how best to help the rebels. The Soviet leadership unequivocally declared immediate assistance in the spirit of the 1943 Soviet-Czechoslovak Treaty of Friendship, Mutual Assistance and Post-War Cooperation. More difficult was immediate military assistance. Only the troops of the First Ukrainian Front could move in the shortest direction. The troops of this front in heavy battles in June, July and August defeated the powerful German group Northern Ukraine, expelled Hitler's troops from the whole Ukraine, forced the San River and reached the Vistula, where they created a bridgehead of operational importance to the south of Warsaw, and with their left wing reached the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains. Fierce fighting took place here throughout August. By the end of August, the units operating in this direction were very tired. Rifle divisions had about half of the regular staff, lacked combat equipment, mainly tanks, ammunition, and were in urgent need of a long rest and additional staffing. Under the existing conditions, the decision of the commander of the First Ukrainian Front to agree in principle to storm the Carpathians with the forces of the front was more than audacious. And it was not only because the command knew the condition of the troops. The command also knew that there were special types of battles to be fought, for which the troops, because of their lack of experience in fighting in mountainous terrain, had not been trained and for which they were not properly equipped and armed. For the 3 preceding years, the Soviet units had fought mainly on flat terrain. They were accustomed to the steppes and forests, where they had first defended splendidly, and then, during cold winters, exhausting heat and spring thaw, had vigorously taken the offensive. Now the troops had to fight in difficult mountainous conditions against an experienced, strong enemy who had the opportunity to build a deeply echelon defense system here for months. On 2 September, Marshal Konev, the commander of the First Ukrainian Front, urgently summoned the commander of the 38th Army, Colonel General Moskalenko, and informed him that the 38th Army and the right wing of the 4th Ukrainian Front, namely the 1st Guards Army under the command of Colonel General Grechko, operating in the Carpathians, were assigned the task of undertaking an offensive operation to help the Slovak national uprising. This is how the Carpathian Duklinskaya operation was conceived. The 38th Army, the left flank army of the front, bore the brunt of the fighting. It consisted of 3 rifle corps, a total of 9 rifle divisions, and before the beginning of the fighting it was reinforced by a tank corps. The Guards Cavalry Corps, numerous artillery reinforcement units, including reactive ones, and the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps. The operation was to develop from the basin of the Vistula and Yamulka rivers towards the foothills north of the main Carpathian range. For 3 months the enemy had been building up his defences here, consisting of 3 lines. The depth of the defence reached 50 kilometres. Ideological creators and organisers of the operation plan in September 1944, striving to ensure the success of the operation, were aware of the exclusivity of an extremely difficult task, which was characterised by great risk and unknown end. In addition, no one knew what adjustments in their calculations will make general weather. And the weather just made its corrections. However, they decided to launch an offensive even in bad weather in order to help the rebels as quickly as possible. Who doubts this? Let him remember how much time was given to the 38th Army to prepare for this heavy operation. The plan of operation of the commander of the 1st Ukrainian Front was approved by the Stavka on 4 September, and the beginning of the offensive was scheduled for 8 September. This, in my opinion, best proves the international, selfless nature of Soviet assistance to the uprising. The main idea of the front commander was to destroy the enemy in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains with the forces of the 38th Army, then to develop the success through the main Carpathian Ridge, and on the 5th day of the offensive to reach the line of Stara-Dubovnia. The main blow was to be struck along the Duklinskaya communication line Krasno, Dukelje-Duklinsky Pass, Esvidnik. The plan took into account the assurance of the Czechoslovak representatives that the two Slovak divisions of the Eastern Slovak Corps, which had been entrenched in the Carpathians since spring, would hold the Carpathian passes and thus make possible a quick connection of the Soviet army with the insurgents. It was planned to create a strike grouping of the army north and northwest of the town of Krasno. It was planned to break through the German defence 8 kilometres wide to the northwest of this city. Already on 4 September, the commander of the front, Marshal Konev, sent his directive to the 38th Army and gave it the necessary means of reinforcement. On the first day of the offensive, army troops were to penetrate to a depth of 10-12 kilometres. On the third day of the operation, they should have reached the borders of Slovakia, to which they were still 25 kilometres. The mobile group and the second echelon of the army, the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps, were introduced into the battle only on September 9. On the second day of the offensive from the boundary of the Zimi-Grudnova Valley, the town of Dukorjar, removed from the breakthrough front by 20 kilometres, the army commander, based on the directive of the front commander, decided that the 52nd, 101st and 67th Infantry Corps of the first echelon would break through the enemy defence in the specified strip, destroy the enemy's first echelon forces during the first day of the operation, and develop the success to a depth of 15-20 kilometres. From the directive of the commander of the front and the decision of the commander of the 38th Army can be seen what importance both top commanders attached to the speed of the offensive. 18.2 of the offensive was high, unheard of. 2,000 keys a day for a motorized rifle corps, 40 kilometers for a cavalry corps, 25 kilometers for a tank corps. Marshal Konev warned that if the troops did not quickly pass the Carpathians, they would suffer heavy losses. The decisive success was supposed to be achieved during the first and second days of the operation. It was a question of finally destroying the enemy in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains, and thus creating a decisive superiority of forces over the defending enemy, to keep the high pace of the offensive until the completion of the task or at least the crossing of the main Carpathian Ridge. The army was advancing in a strip 68 kilometres wide, but the main blow came to the 8-kilometre stretch between the village of Dnieper and Krasno. 6 infantry divisions out of 9, all tank units and 82% of all artillery, were concentrated in this section. There was 4.5 kilometres of frontage per division against the enemy's 20.5 kilometres. The density of artillery in the breakthrough area reached 140 guns and mortars per kilometre of front. The number of tanks in direct support of infantry in the direction of the main strike was, however, only 6 tanks and self-propelled guns per kilometre of front. In the strip of the 38th Army defended 3 infantry divisions and some other units of the 11th CIS Army Corps, part of the 17th Army, and the 24th Tank Corps of the 1st Tank Army. The total depth of the enemy defence in the direction of the main strike was 6-7 kilometres. Each strip had 2 defensive positions, each at a depth of 1,200–2,000 metres. Operational reserves of the enemy in the offensive strip of the 38th Army were not detected. So the balance of forces did not make the offensive particularly risky. Only a small number of tanks was of concern. However, the relatively high number of guns and mortars did not give full confidence that the very difficult task of completely defeating the enemy in the tactical depth of the defence would be completed. The sudden conditions for success were complete destruction of the enemy in the direction of the main strike, the presence of Slovak divisions on the passes, and a high tempo of the offensive. The second condition was crucial for the rapid development of success in the course of the operations. If after the defeat at Krasno it had been possible to disrupt the organized retreat of the enemy with large forces into the mountains, then it would have been possible to quickly move mobile formations to strike continuous blows against the enemy in operational depth. In this case, the rapid crossing of the Carpathians would have been ensured. Carpathian Duklinskaya operation, however, as sometimes happens in war, did not go according to the course prepared for it. At 8 hours, 45 minutes after artillery preparation and bombardment, which lasted 125 minutes, the troops of the 38th Army began the offensive. The first defences on the breakthrough site were captured quite easily. Then the enemy's resistance began to increase, as under the cover of powerful artillery support he managed to occupy the second line of defence. On 8 September, units of the Shock, 101st Infantry Corps, were stopped by heavy enemy fire in front of positions on the heights south of the settlements of Hokyuvka and Makhnuvka. The town of Krosno, an important transport hub, was not taken despite the fierce fighting. We had to retreat back along the clogged roads. The pace of the offensive after the first great success on 8 September in the afternoon has already begun to weaken. In the morning of 9 September, the situation at the front became completely different. The Nazis realized the catastrophic situation in which they would immediately find themselves if the Soviet troops occupied the area of Presov, Kosice, and found themselves in the rear of the German troops operating in Romania and Hungary. Hitler's command quickly concentrated on the breakthrough area reserves, primarily tank reserves. During the night, the 75th Infantry Division of the enemy and parts of the 1st and 8th Panzer Divisions arrived in a hurry and in the morning entered the battle. In order to organize the defense in the most threatened directions, some units operating against the insurgents were transferred from Slovakia. Hitler's command carried out these first movements of forces with astonishing speed. Thus, the enemy's defensive maneuver at the very beginning strengthened his position, and the tasks of the operation were not fulfilled as planned. 2 Slovak divisions were largely responsible for this. Through the fault of their commanders, they allowed themselves to be disarmed, and thus did not find themselves in the area of the Duklinsky and Lubkovsky passes, from where, in cooperation with the Soviet army, they should have struck in the rear of the enemy and destroyed him. As a result of the treachery of these divisions, the enemy was able to maneuver forces for the defence of the Dukla direction without fearing for his rear. The Slovak divisions, as the main force of the Slovak army, did not join the uprising. As a result, the tempo of the offensive was lost in the decisive initial phase of the battle, and it was difficult to correct this. The strength of enemy resistance was increasing. On the 5th day of the operation, the defending enemy already had an advantage in tanks in a combination of 2.3-1. In men, the forces were equalized. Both sides began to pull up more and more forces. All forces and means of the 38th Army and part of the forces of the 1st Ukrainian Front were drawn into the unusually fierce battles in the mountains with a numerous and well-armed enemy. The brutal and protracted nature of the battles for some dominant heights remained throughout the operation. On 12 September, the 1st Guards Cavalry Corps made a daring rush into the narrow corridor between Lysa and the village of Glois, but its heroic raids in the encirclement, deep behind enemy lines, did not change the situation. By 14 September, already 9 infantry and 2 tank divisions of the enemy entered the battle. To break the enemy resistance, the commander of the 1st Ukrainian Front decided on 15 September to reinforce the 38th Army with new infantry divisions, 2 corps and more artillery. The troops persistently penetrated to the passes, but the closer they came, the harder the fighting became. However, neither exhausting battles nor huge losses did not break the persistence of the Soviet and Czechoslovak soldiers, striving to occupy the Duklinsky Pass as quickly as possible. To cross the Carpathians and to help the Slovak insurgents, they occupied height after height. On 20 September, the town of Dukolja fell under the attack of 2 tank corps from the east in cooperation with the advancing units of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps from the north. The advance of the advancing units in the main Dukolja direction immediately accelerated, but for a short time. On 26 September, in the area of Barvinek and Zindranov, new battles for the heights where the Czechoslovak state border passed. On 6 October, having suffered heavy losses, units of the 1st and 3rd Czechoslovak brigades entered the homeland. However, even after crossing the main Carpathian Ridge, the pace of the offensive did not increase. Again, they had to knock out the enemy's defences height by height. On 24 November, the last enemy defensive position on the heights of Korejovzi, Krajania and Poljana, Bodrujal was taken in the Czechoslovak Corps field of action. The Soviet and Czechoslovak troops went out into the wide open. The slow pace of the offensive was caused by the fierce resistance of the enemy, extremely difficult theatre conditions and bad weather conditions. It was raining, fog was hanging in the mountains, the hard ground turned into heavy, viscous silt and mud. Such difficulties had not been encountered by the troops before. Czechoslovak troops began their actions in the Carpathian-Duklinskaya operation on 8 September at noon. After breaking through the first enemy defensive positions, the artillery of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps was released from participation in the artillery, preparation of the army, and fully concentrated northwest of Krosno in the village of Odřikon, where it was assigned to support the infantry of both our infantry brigades. At 1700 hours, the difficult, slow advance of the Czechoslovak Corps began on bad roads towards the gap made in the enemy defense by the Soviet 1st Echelon divisions. In difficult conditions, the Corps units bypassed the town of Krosno from the west, which continued to resist the Soviet troops, blocking the crossroads and reducing the pace of the offensive. On the night of 9 September, the 3rd Brigade, acting as the Corps advance unit, reached the village of Rotsanki. The 1st Brigade reached Moknuvka by morning. Both brigades were preparing to move to their original lines and launch an attack on the enemy positions, which seemed poorly defended. However, the command of the Corps and the 3rd Brigade made a mistake in their calculations. The enemy opened a preemptive fire on the striking part of both brigades and inflicted heavy losses on them. The 3rd Brigade in Rokanka suffered a concentrated attack and suffered particularly heavy losses. It was not the weak, retreating enemy, about whom, by the way, the command did not have sufficient information, but fresh units, which the enemy during the night moved to the place of the breakthrough. On that Black Friday, 9 September, the total losses of the Corps amounted to 611 men. Such was the sad balance of the offensive, which had been planned with such prospects for success and prepared with such enthusiasm and dreams of victory. The Corps commander was dismissed. Marshal Konev appointed General Svoboda as Corps commander. Using the successes of his neighbour on the right, the new commander on 10 September regrouped his forces while marching to the right wing of the Corps' front to attack the key height 534, which overlooked the town of Dukelja from the west. With a decisive attack, the 1st Brigade captured this height, which dominated the terrain. Here, from 12 to 19 September day and night, there were fierce battles. The vast bare peak during this time changed hands several times. The ground on it was literally ploughed over by artillery shells and mines. The battle for height 534 became a battle for the last rockade communication of Zemigrudnova, the town of Dukelj north of the Dukelj Pass, which was still in the hands of the German command. In order to regain the height, the enemy introduced more and more infantry and tank reserves into the battle. The same persistent battles were fought for the settlements of Frankov, Theodorovka, Gelenovka, Gloyas, and Ivla, located in the immediate vicinity of this height. Continuous 5-day battles exhausted the units to the extreme. Heavy losses reduced morale. During the 6 days of fighting from 9 to 14 September, the total losses of the 1st Infantry Brigade were 1873 men, and of the 3rd Brigade, 1036 men. Truly fantastic efforts were made to capture and hold height 534. They had no equal during the whole period of the Corps offensive on the approaches to the main Carpathian Ridge. Front commanders and combat documents of that time testify to the nature of the battles. Height 534 from September 13 became the centre of unheard of fierce fighting. On that day, the enemy, with the strength of up to 2 battalions, supported by tanks and heavy artillery and mortar fire, attacked 5 times in order to regain the key height, which he had lost on 12 September. However, all these fierce attacks were met by equally fierce counterattacks by units of the 1st Brigade. On 12 September, the Czechoslovak infantry and artillery had a particularly hard time. First at 7.15, then at 11:30, then at 15:30 and 16.40, and at the very end of the day at 18.45 the fighters went up to the attack and finally captured the height. However, the battles for height 534 continued with unrelenting vigour in the following days. We read about it in the report of the commander of the 3rd Battalion from 16 September. On the 7th day, the battalion was fighting continuously. During the day, we make several attacks. All the time we are under heavy mortar and machine gun fire. People in the trenches are sleep-deprived and malnourished, big losses in manpower. The soldiers are on the verge of exhaustion. About this height recalls also General Ludwig Svoboda. Height 534, he writes, witnessed the fiercest fighting. So much happened around this height that all those who survived these battles will never forget it. A great many people were missing at that time. As a rule, they were wounded, which Hitlerites found on the battlefield and killed them. From 12 to 19 September east of the town of Dukeljar, in the 67th Rifle Corps, the 2nd Parachute and Airborne Brigade, which consisted mainly of Slovaks, entered the battle. Later this brigade was transferred from the front to the Krosno area, where from 22 September it was preparing for airborne landing in the area of the Slovak national uprising. The brigade's participation in the battle east of Krosno, in cooperation with 2 fresh Soviet tank corps, had a significant impact on the situation in the Duklinsky Pass area. After the ejection, this brigade became the main striking force of the uprising. On 20 September, as a result of the offensive of the Soviet 14th Guards Division and units of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps, the town of Dukeljar was liberated. In this battle, the 3rd Brigade was successful, whose units suffered heavy losses near the village of Vratsanka on 9 September due to erroneous calculations of the command. On 20 September, General Klapalik, who had just arrived, took command of the brigade right during the battle. About 4 o'clock in the evening, his infantry penetrated into the town. Fierce fighting broke out in the streets. To keep the city, Hitlerites, with the support of tanks and aviation, made fruitless attacks. At last, the resistance of the enemy was broken, and to the west of the city, in the area of height 534. However, the enemy immediately consolidated on another favourable defensive line. On 21 September at 19 o'clock, exhausted, thinned corps units found themselves in front of a new, powerful enemy position, which ran along the mountain ridge south of the highway Zmigrud Novi Dukeljar. The battles were fought mainly over the vast bare massif of Jirova Mountain, which like a bastion towered over the valley opposite the blood-stained height 534. The infantrymen of the 1st Brigade, seemingly exhausted by the long battle for the height, were no longer capable of such a feat, but they took the formidable mountain. Their maneuver surprised even the army commander himself. They seized the slopes of the mountain first and, having organized a circular defense, repelled fierce counterattacks of the enemy. They successfully defended their positions at night and finally captured the top of the mountain. Richard Tesazik's tanks played a decisive role in this episode. On Jirova Mountain, the brave tanker with the gold star of the hero of the Soviet Union on his chest was wounded in the eye in this battle. Jirova Mountain was the last powerful obstacle on the way to the pass. With its capture opened the way to the Czechoslovak borders, and it inspired the fighters to heroic feats. After 2 days of fighting, it was possible to occupy Jirova Hora, but despite great efforts it was not possible to expand the breakthrough area to the west. The enemy pulled up new reserves in this area, the 1st Mountain Infantry Division, which he transferred from Western Europe. At the time when the 1st Czechoslovak Corps was fighting on Jirova Gora for the expansion of the breakthrough area in the western direction, the army commander, thanks to the use of a large number of artillery, tanks and aircraft, managed to break the enemy resistance on the narrow front along the Dukla Highway and to advance to the Dukla Pass itself and the villages of Barvinek and Zindranova, to give the Czechoslovak units the opportunity to be the first to set foot on their native land. They were withdrawn from their position on Jirova Gora and on 28 September were sent to replace the Soviet troops standing in the immediate vicinity of the Czechoslovak borders. The first period of heavy fighting was over. The troops of the 38th Army for 19 days advanced in the direction of the main strike by 36 kilometers. And now the Czechoslovak soldiers stood in front of the mountain peaks, along which the state border of Czechoslovakia passed. Ahead was the battle, and everyone dreamed that it would end with the desired entry into their native land. The fighting was still fierce and protracted. However, the proximity of the homeland gave strength. On 30 September at 9 a.m., the infantry, supported by 11 tanks of the 1st Czechoslovakian Tank Brigade, made an attack, but the advance of the corps along the entire front was repelled by enemy fire and counterattacks. Attempts by the units to break through to the Czechoslovak borders via the Bezimianaya Height, southeast of Barvinek, were also futile. This height changed hands several times during the day. Here, the last 7 tanks of the brigade were hit. By order of the army commander, the offensive continued into the night. Attempts to break through to the borders were unsuccessful on 1 October. The units of the 1st and 3rd Brigades that advanced as a result of the attacks were immediately driven back by counterattacks. The enemy resistance on the heights along the border could not be broken. Even the mass heroism of infantry and tankers did not bring success. The enemy stubbornly defended. Czechoslovak soldiers, who saw their native land from the heights and the roads running inland, continued to tear forward. When the attempt to break through the enemy defence by frontal attack failed, an attempt was made to bypass the pass from the west. The reason for this was the success of the 241st Infantry Division, the Corps' neighbour on the right, which on 1 October captured the Studenovaya Hill and crossed the Kopcovaya Hill and crossed the Czechoslovak state border. Here, for the first time on Czechoslovak territory, the foot of the liberators set foot. In order to develop the success, the army commander, by his order of 2 October, replaced the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps with the Soviet 359th Division, and the corps was redeployed to the area of the forest under Studenoj Hill to Sabov in order to break the enemy's defence from the west by striking in the direction of Krajna Porubka, Krajna Bystra, Nizhny Kamanik. In heavy fighting on 3 October, the corps units failed to break the enemy resistance. The corps commander cancelled the order to attack the next day due to the fatigue of the troops. On 4 October, another attempt was made to capture the enemy defensive positions, as by this time the Soviet troops had struck in the rear of the enemy. Tank units and troops of the 67th Rifle Corps west of the pass broke through to the Pizanu Valley. In this situation, the army commander ordered to continue the offensive with the main forces of the army to the rear of the enemy defences at the pass, and the exhausted forces of the 1st Czechoslovak Corps to regroup for the offensive in the original direction along the main Dukla highway, and to replace the 359th Rifle Division in this direction until 5 October. The regrouping of the corps was carried out under extremely difficult conditions. The exhausted soldiers now had to fight with the harsh nature in the mountains. They walked under the incessant downpour, drowning in heavy sticky mud, and with all this frequent fierce clashes with the enemy, the corps arrived at its destination only on the 5th of October. When it became known that the defence of the pass, under the threat of coverage, hesitated, reinforced reconnaissance detachments came forward, which in the morning crossed the border of Czechoslovakia. The Duklinsky Pass was taken. The long agony was over, the road home was open. The soldiers of the 1st and 3rd Brigades descended down the southern slopes of the mountains into the valley, to the first liberated Slovak village of Nizhny Kamanik, and shot upwards with joy. They were returning to their native land. It seemed that nothing could stand in their way. There, beyond the chain of peaks to the south of the lower Kamanik, the end of all torment and suffering awaited them. Only the last heights remained to be taken. However, the thorny path is far from over. The victory over the enemy is undoubtedly great, but not final. And the soldiers who ran down the slope were still showered by the enemy with a hail of bullets. The Czechoslovaks were forced to entrench and then went on the attack. Again and again they went up to the attack, and no tangible results were seen yet. For several weeks the battles for the same height were fought. Again and again the directions of the main blows were changed, all in vain. The enemy, despite heavy losses, fiercely defended the last defensive position at the exit from the Carpathians, and Czechoslovak soldiers spilled a lot of blood in the harsh battles on the heights of Grabov and Javira, at Medvedje near Krajna Bystra, and on the formidable Obsara. The troops were tired, suffered heavy losses, the fighting mood was decreasing, and the battle was dragging on, and no visible successes had been observed so far. All this worried the corps commander Ludwig Svoboda. He was well aware of the seriousness of this situation. The general himself was tired of these protracted battles and was suffering from increasing losses. On the memorable day of 6 October, when all Czechoslovak soldiers were rejoicing over the victory at Dukla, the newly appointed commander of the 1st Czechoslovak Brigade, General Vedral Sazavsky, died. It happened like this. The general stood pensively for a while near a newly erected border post, and then got into a car to catch up with the brigade that was pursuing the enemy. Hardly had the car started when it hit a hidden anti-tank mine. The mine explosion threw the general out of the car. When he was found, he was breathless. The officers accompanying him were either killed or badly wounded. Shortly before the catastrophe, several cars passed through the dangerous place, but the mine did not explode, and there is now a polished stone symbolizing the general's heart in the memorial complex at Dukla. The artillery was finally silenced in the Carpathians only at the end of November. General Klapalik was almost killed here. Descending from Mount Prikroy, one of the last Carpathian peaks, he and his guide fell into an anti-personnel minefield. As a result of the explosion, several men were killed and wounded. Fortunately, the explosion occurred somewhat away from the general. Artillery during the fighting for Dukla played a decisive role. Its tasks were very heavy. With its fire artillery destroyed the enemy and suppressed the fire of his artillery before the attack, and then paved the way for infantry and tanks. Supporting the attacks of its troops and repelling fierce counterattacks of the enemy, artillery in the conditions of the Carpathians fulfilled a significant part of combat tasks. However, despite its almost untouched combat power, the fairly numerous artillery of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps did not always achieve the desired results. The enemy sometimes managed to resist the most concentrated artillery and mortar fire. Thus, on 21 November 1944, together with the Corps Commander General Svoboda, we tensely watched from an observation point above Lower Komarnik our artillery preparation on the enemy's defensive positions. It seemed that the height was literally on fire. Shells were falling so thickly on it. Our infantry approached the German defences very quickly. But then, however, the counterattack was thrown back to the original line. This is how all the battles for the Carpathian Heights were fought. To take the Carpathian rampart and reach Ondava, the Soviet and Czechoslovak troops had to overcome 6 mountain ranges, 6 favourable frontiers which ran perpendicular to the direction of the offensive. From 3 September to 27 November 1944, 80 days instead of the planned 5, the fighting continued, which with its intensity and drama resembled the most persistent battles on the Soviet-German front during the Great Patriotic War. Although the Carpathian-Duklin operation did not fulfill all its objectives, the long and extremely persistent battle with a strong enemy had a decisive influence on the development and course of the Slovak national uprising. On the German side, 18 divisions took part in the battle, 3 of them tank divisions. These were all the units that the Nazi command was able to pull from the Soviet-German front to the Dukla theatre of operations between September and November. This battle was like a magnet attracting more and more enemy forces that could be used against the Slovak national uprising. However, the liberating character of Soviet aid definitely ruled out any other solution than to continue the offensive, in spite of great difficulties and losses. The battles at Dukla made an important contribution to the development of our people's fighting traditions, and the day of 6 October, when units of the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps first entered their native land, rightfully became the day of the Czechoslovak People's Army. This reflects the extremely great military and political significance of the Carpathian-Duklin operation. Here, for the first time, resistance forces operating inside and outside the country were united. Dukelja became a symbol of the liberation of the Czechoslovak people. It became a gateway to freedom and a monument to Czechoslovak-Soviet friendship, forged in bloody battles against a common enemy and in the close friendship of both armies. In the battles in the Carpathians, the Czechoslovak soldiers learnt by harsh experience what it means to attack our border mountains, those mountains which in 1938 could be successfully defended and which the enemy now used to the full extent. Dukelja was a vivid demonstration of the liberating mission of the Soviet army. History knows few such examples of an ally coming to the aid of the Soviet army at a difficult moment, sacrificing personal interests. In moral, political and military terms, Dukelja partially redeemed the cowardice, treason, selfishness and cowardice of our bourgeoisie during the Munich period. The Duklin operation has gone down in history. With its name will forever be linked to the memory of the heroic battle of Soviet and Czechoslovak soldiers, who at the cost of the blood of 84,000 dead, wounded and missing paved the way to a free Czechoslovakia. Of the total number of losses, 7,000 fell to the 1st Czechoslovak Army Corps in the USSR. The Duklin operation will serve as an example of selfless and the best military qualities of thousands of Czechs and Slovaks, who without hesitation sacrificed their lives in the fight against the enemy. Staff Captain Joseph Kohl, commander of the 1st Battalion of the 1st Czechoslovak Brigade, died on Girova Mountain. Later he was honoured with the title of Hero of the Czechoslovak Cesar. In the battles for the Bezemianaya Heights near Barvinik in the last tanks, Lieutenant Colonel Jazluk, commander of a tank company, and Captain Vrana E, commander of a tank battalion, were killed. Both of them were posthumously awarded the title of hero at the Kaskavak. During the operation, the enemy lost only killed and wounded more than 70,000 people. More than 30,000 German soldiers and officers were captured, and more than 1,000 guns and mortars, 130 tanks and other weapons were captured as trophies. Dukla must forever remain a symbol of the combat alliance between the Soviet and Czechoslovak peoples. When I was appointed Deputy Chief of Artillery of the Corps, I experienced some confusion. The battles were fought for Obsha Mountain, located south of Nizhny Kamanik, and for the approach to the extremely Polani Gorge. The Nazis were holding on to the last defensive positions at the exit from the Carpathians with all their might. We bombarded the enemy with concentrated artillery fire, but all in vain. We could not throw the Germans down from the mountains into the Ondava Valley. How do they stay alive up there? I asked myself this question for the umpteenth time. At that time I did not yet know the enemy's tactics. Our artillery fire made a strong impression, but its practical result was small compared to the ammunition expended. There was something here that I did not know. In the evening after the battle, unexpectedly for myself, I decided to ask for an audience with General Svoboda at the Corps command post in Barwinake. He received me with a concerned look, placing his spectacles on a map laid out on a rude peasant's table. Svoboda gave me his hand and invited me to sit down on the bench beside him. In the faint light of a twisted paraffin lamp, the sharp features of his face seemed softer. A fire burned lazily in the stove, and a wooden bed with carefully folded blankets stood in the corner. From the neighbouring room came the thumping of a typewriter and a monotonously dictating voice. The corps commander looked tired. "What have you got?" asked the general, and looked inquisitively into my eyes. "General," I twitted hesitantly. "No. Today we fired 3,000 shells and mines on Obshara and Bezimayanaya and the Germans. No." The general realized that this was not all, and waited patiently. I continued. "This infantry ceases to believe us. Loss of confidence in the artillery, a serious matter." General Svoboda looked at me questioningly, and it was immediately clear to me that all this is not news to him. I wanted to finish my thought, but he interrupted my thought. "Yeah, you guys are really messed up, and it's costing us a lot of blood." The reproach was directed at me, and I blushed. Artillery did not fulfill its task, it was clear. But what was our mistake? I remembered the losses, which were increasing every day, and inside me everything burned as if I were burning with a red-hot iron. In my mind, I told myself that my inability was to blame. We could not suppress the enemy, to disrupt his counterattacks, in a word, to destroy him. I was fully aware of the bitter truth that the infantry had exhausted its strength, that its numbers had fallen to the lowest level, and at the same time the artillery was in excellent condition and, despite this, could not deliver a devastating blow to the enemy. I wondered what to say to the corps commander to his reproachful remark about our misfires. "With the reconnaissance means at our disposal," I said, "it is quite impossible to discover the location of objects and shoot at specific targets. We shoot all over the place, everywhere and nowhere. In the end, we are just throwing ammunition around, and as soon as the infantry goes to attack, the enemy stops it by fire and counterattack." I didn't know General Liberty's character yet, and I wasn't myself from his silence. At least he should say something to let me know what he was thinking. I had no choice but to continue my monologue. The tension in the room was rising. "And then, General," I said, "because of the lack of time, we do not have time to carry out artillery reconnaissance and detect enemy fire points." And then I remembered what I had thought many times before, and quickly added, "We should not start the offensive immediately after the artillery preparation. It helps the enemy to guess the beginning of the attack of our units. Maybe it would be better to start the attack during the artillery preparation, at the moment when the tempo and power of the firing reaches its peak." The general nodded, and I was relieved to feel that the corps commander was not in the mood to reject my criticisms. And in fact, I had not yet got used to the corps, and already I'm interfering with my advice. Cheered up, I hastily blurted "We need information, Mr. General. We must have good information, General. We must have good information." Having spoken out, I suddenly realized that all my urgent requests were inappropriate, because the corps commander himself knew very well what we needed. The general squinted his eyes, and it seemed to me as if he smiled slightly. "I'm glad you came," he said calmly, and ran a hand through his long grey hair, slicked back. On his broad face, There was an expression of friendly good-naturedness. He was indeed genuinely pleased to have a man who understood the weight of responsibility that lay on his shoulders. During the conversation, the general moved from business to domestic issues and was extremely attentive to the interlocutor. SSEs will not it. If I had such scouts with whom we started, you would not be sitting without information now that these guys are gone. There was a sad pause. Then General Svoboda lowered his voice conspiratorially and leaned towards, "I will soon make you happy." So something was in preparation. This fueled my curiosity, but I could not get anything substantial out of the commander. He looked thoughtfully and spoke quietly, rather to himself. "I know the work of scouts is hard. The enemy is cautious. This, however, cannot justify failure." And, as if again aware of my presence, he looked at me and said in a different way, "The terrain and weather conditions are favourable for reconnaissance, but the results cannot yet be called satisfactory. Despite categorical orders to take the tongue, the reconnaissance teams are returning with bare hands." The general spoke slowly, calmly, only sometimes suddenly raising his voice, emphasizing a word, then lowering it again to its original calm state. "All the more we must use the fighting power of our artillery." I pondered, and suddenly I noticed that a shadow ran across the general's face. "About ammunition, do not worry. Everything goes now to the main direction, to the west," suddenly categorically stated the corps commander. Major Lomsky, Chief of Staff, entered the room. A dense figure, heavy steep forehead over the sunken eyes. It gave the impression of a thinking man. The Chief of Staff put the last list of losses in front of the general. "You see," said the corps commander in a slumped voice, turning in my direction. "At Bezimianaya 22 men have again dropped from the list of personnel. If it goes on like this, He fell silent and looked somewhere in the distance. I was silent too. I began to read the columns of surnames. One of them was familiar to me. I went outside and plunged into the cold night air. My mind was filled with all sorts of thoughts, and in front of my eyes I kept seeing that fateful list. Yesterday it was people, today it was just names. The mud crunched underfoot. Someone ahead of me swore. At home, I sat down with my head in my hands. In my mind's eye I saw the dead falling on the pine needles in the forest, and the picture tormented me with its painful clarity. I did not notice how I fell asleep. In my dream I saw many of our fighters. They stood in slender rows in the middle of the destroyed forest, standing firmly, as if they had grown into the stone soil of the mountain. I took off my hat and looked at their faces for a long time. Suddenly I woke up. It was an amazing dream. Everything was as if it were real. I opened the window. The cool, moist night air enveloped me. I stretched out my hand. Droplets of rain and snow appeared on it. The house was very crowded. I wanted to go outside, into the weather, into the wide open space. It was 12 o'clock. Drowning up to my ankles in the mud and snow, I wandered towards the Dukla highway. Trying to step into the tracks that others had made here, I kept bumping into ammunition boxes. The mud clung to my feet. Finally, I got out of the Carpathian mud and followed the motorway up to the pass. Refreshed by the breeze, I stood on a historical mountain boundary, which had long been the border of two worlds. Suddenly, I realized why I had taken this risky night walk, what had actually driven me out of the house in the rain and bad weather. In the darkness of the night, I instinctively identified the location of Nameless and, as if expecting something, I looked in that direction. The mountain was shrouded in the rainy night and therefore seemed even more mysterious. It was quiet. Silence is necessary where the living rest, but after the battle there is a terrible silence. I couldn't stop thinking. Tomorrow I'll climb Bezimianaya. I must do it. I must determine on the spot why there is no end to these battles. The cold got under my overcoat and I began to think of returning. Suddenly I intuitively felt that there was someone else on the pass besides me. I pulled out my gun. For a minute we stood silently facing each other. Both of us were agitated. Then I hesitantly moved closer and caught a glimpse of the pale oval of a woman's face. A woman, when she recognized me, she sighed with relief. "Mira, what are you doing here at this hour?" "What are you looking for?" "I'm waiting for the sun to rise over Bezimianaya," I joked, and then asked seriously. "Vera, why are you awake?" She was silent, but after a minute she spoke in a whisper with a tremor in her voice. "I am afraid for him. I'll be there tomorrow. I'll look for him." I and Vera, the liaison of the corps headquarters, stood by a small military cemetery with fresh graves. softly, barely audibly falling from the trees to the ground wet snow. Having calmed down a little, I returned to the house, finally deciding to go to the heights in the morning, to Bezimanaya. The next morning was overcast. When we left, there was a light wind. We passed the pass and took the motorway down the south side. I could barely restrain myself from running down the snow-covered slope straight to the top. We were approaching a section of the motorway which at this time was usually shelled by a German battery. It must be said that my new driver, Private S. Pasek, was clearly afraid. Unbidden, but at the same time quite definitely, he let me know that we should stop. That made me angry. Why on earth would I stomp for 4 kilometers when I could drive them? We drove a little more. Space started begging again, saying that here was the best place to stop. Against his wishes, I ordered him to drive on. We stopped at the school in Lower Kilmarnock, right under the formidable Obsha mountain, on which our units had unsuccessfully attacked the enemy. We found ourselves in no man's land, where any trouble was possible at any moment. We could hear neither gunfire nor shell bursts. There was a sullen silence. I was cautiously making my way with Private Petasik to the old wooden Orthodox church, which, unscathed by the war, towered above the village. Suddenly, in the morning twilight, we noticed something incomprehensible. Leaning to the ground, some creature was heading in our direction. Friend or foe? And was it even human? I suggested to my companion to crawl forward, but Petasik did not react. Then we switched roles. I did not rule out that it was German intelligence and prepared for the worst. But it turned out the other way round. In a few minutes the riddle was solved. With a sigh of relief, I patted the skinny sides of the stray goat. Gradually the bottom of the Kamarnitsa gorge became visible, but the nearby peaks were still drowned in the slowly rising fog. We stood by the church, silent and uncertain. It was so quiet that it seemed as if the war had long since ended. But as soon as we looked down at the snow-covered wreckage of vehicles and wrecked military equipment, the war immediately reminded us of itself. This region was always quiet. The one who visited these places in spring forever fell into the soul of the marvellous nature, with light winds blowing towards the pass, with talkative streams, around which blossoms a sea of windflowers, lambsquaters and violet. Those who came here in summer were enchanted by the pictures of mountain villages with the peaceful ringing of tin bells of cows, with rings of lazy smoke rising from the chimneys of squat houses, which made the evening air even more fragrant. When the winds from the pass blew here, the tall grass behind the village rippled lightly, and in the fields and meadows near Dukla the skirts of women and the cloth of men's shirts fluttered in the wind. There was no more beautiful place than in this forgotten corner, but there was no greater poverty than here, near the main Carpathian ridge. However, trapped in winter sadness and looking at the devastated places around me, I firmly believed that the scorched Carpathian village under Kamarnitska Gora would not disappear from the face of the earth, that the ruins of the houses would not be overgrown with moss, and that spring would come again to this marvellous region. My thoughts were interrupted by a single shot. I looked up at the summit. The fractured, shattered remnants of the forest stuck out unsteadily to the horizon. The quiet white morning calm in this dead chaos on and below the mountain was as frightening as the terrible rumble of the battle. It was now quite dawning. We passed through the wooded debris, crossed the stream on its high steep bank, crept through the dense shrubbery, and along the steep slope of the Tora began to climb upwards. By this time a battle had broken out on the heights. Our units were supported by the entire Corps artillery and a Soviet mortar brigade. Suddenly we saw 2 Soviet soldiers lying motionless. A little to the side, face down on the ground, lay a third. We looked round at them, hoping to help them, and were completely oblivious to what was going on around us. The bullets were whistling near us. It was not surprising. There was a battle going on above us, and naturally the bullets were coming here. Instinctively realizing the danger, we hurried away from the place. The soldiers needed no help. We travelled east, and on the northern slope of Bezimanaya, we met the commander of the 5th Battalion. I informed him about those dead. He just waved his hand and explained that a few minutes ago they had been snapped by a sniper. My heart throbbed. Perhaps our fiddling with the dead had saved us. "I'm coming to you," I said on the phone to Captain Kunzel, the commander of the Special Corps group which was in the centre of the attack. No, for God's sake, please don't go," he shouted. "We are in a very difficult position. We're just being covered with mines. I have no escort. Everything is mined. Don't." "You may not go." I mentally said to myself, "Your fighting place is not here, not on this hill." "Well, no, I must go there. I must, brother." I weighed everything properly, but still I could not rid myself of the feeling that I was doing wrong, and yet I went alone. The morning wind rocked the forest, and wet snow fell from the branches to the ground. I was already a third of the way down the slope, and once again I wondered if I should go any further. You want to help people, Altitude? That's good. But how will you help them when it could all be over for you today? Who will benefit from your death? You're not going to gain anything up there, not even a little bit. So why the hell are you going in there? I've been thinking. You're alone, nobody can see you. Turn back, give it up. You won't lose any prestige, but, Lieutenant Colonel, suddenly spoke the voice of duty. How can you pass up in the face of danger? Go on and don't be afraid. When you get to the heights, everyone will cheer up at once. They say that things are not so bad for us if you can get to us. Two voices fought in me, and I had to judge them. It was getting harder and harder to walk. Doubts were eating away at my soul, and my resolve was melting away like smoke. I continued to climb slowly, though my anxiety was growing. And then I saw them. There were two of them. One was lying on his back, his left leg ended above the ankle, his right shoulder was torn. The other was lying a meter away from him, facing the ground, and was mutilated beyond recognition. At the sight of these two Czechoslovak soldiers, I was seized with horror. All my good thoughts were immediately rendered useless. This neighbourhood was booby-trapped. There could not have been a worse warning than this. To the infantryman on Bezimanaya, I can no longer pass. How now to find out why this mountain will not conquer us? With slow, cautious steps, trying to follow my footsteps, I went back down into the valley. I was angry with myself for not listening to the voice of common sense, and now I had to cowardly run away from danger. I should have gone up, round the minefield. I nagged myself. But how would I have been able to determine the boundaries of the danger zone without a mine detector? Torn by doubts, constrained by my own indecision, I stopped at the stream and began to consider again whether I should not return. My final decision was helped by the automatic rifles, which started working at the same moment. Judging by the fact that the German machine guns could be heard much better than ours, I decided that a hit-to-right counterattack had begun upstairs. Through the rumble of firing came a series of explosions of hand grenades and the cracking of mines. I became terrified. With a trained ear, I determined that our troops were retreating. Then there was no reason for me to hang around. I condemned myself to the role of a helpless witness of a heavy battle fought by our infantrymen against a superior enemy. I had to get to the observation post as quickly as possible. I crossed the stream and hurried along the bushes to Komarnitskaya Hill. All these vicissitudes annoyed me terribly. I must use my abilities for their intended purpose. Well, not always surrender to one's own intentions can be called desertion. On that inclement day of 20 November, Antonin Sohor and I were sitting in Bar Winkay and taking advantage of the silence. We chatted about everything. He was already feeling well after his wound at altitude 534. Sohor told me how he used to feel before the next operation. He lived in constant expectation of something unusual. He lived as if death did not exist for him. Although he did talk about it sometimes, it never happened. He repeated that I did not realize my dangerous tasks delighted him, but he never hoped blindly on a voice. If a man is too sure of himself, that's not good either. It upsets the balance, he used to say. And Sohor did not lose his composure either when he was in mortal danger or when he simply ignored it. The phone rang, the commander said into the receives. I need language, come in. We stopped talking. I looked Sohor in the eyes with a searching look. The sharp features of his face testified to his unbending will. His straight, somewhat long nose stood out. But what attracted me most about him were his eyes, very special eyes. They glittered with fire or radiated soft benevolence. I could read his whole life in them. People with such eyes don't ask questions even when they take risks. They even die easily. It was as if his face was made for a portrait. I looked at Sohor and thought, now he is going to go on a mission, perhaps to follow the one who went before him, and then someone else will take Sohor's place. And God knows when that line will end. General Svoboda slowly sauntered around the room, then stopped and looked Sohor in the eye. Antonin, you need a language very much, just urgently. And you need it today, because tomorrow it will be too late. I see, said Sohor in his calm, almost indifferent voice, and looked at the commander. You need a knowledgeable tongue to be of any use, the general added. Nameless continues to resist, Artillerymen do not know the targets. He ran his fingers through his grey hair, as he always did when he was concentrating on something, and then, as if apologizing for assigning such a task, he said more calmly, "It's not an order. I know you were wounded, and yet it is better for you to go. General Moskalenko calls every day and asks when the corps will fulfill its task. Take some reliable guys with you." Sohor's attention was already fixed on the map. He was listening to the corps commander, and mentally he had already started the task. Sohor stood over the map, straightened up, and decisively pointed his finger. "Here we will cross." After some hesitation, he came to the conclusion. Although the Germans in such places a lot of mines, but still the area Javorina to the east of Savannah, on the very left wing of the corps, seems to him the most suitable for such an enterprise. Gaps and precipices, dense forest. A few boys would be lost here like a grain in a field, and for a solid guard the Nazis do not have enough forces here anyway. They discussed the task, talked about cooperation with the partisans. To reassure the general, Sohor assured him that the risk in these places was not very great, and described to the commander the road they would take. They would go through the forest directly to Hertzovata, go round the village of Prikru in a great arc, go down through the forest to Bodruzalu, and infiltrate the garrison there. Sohor already knew how easy it was to move behind the front line. Don't just think about what will happen to you if you are captured. "You've thought of everything well." "Me," said the general, and shook Sohor's hand with gratitude. In farewell, the commander once again reminded that the importance of this mission goes beyond the corps. We must break through the defences at Abshara and Bezimianaya as soon as possible and reach the press-off direction. On the morning of 21 November, Major Engel, Chief of Reconnaissance, and Lieutenant Sohor, with a 5-man reconnaissance team, went to the 1st Battalion observation post. Here is what one of the scouts later recounted. "We had musculuts on our overcoats. Their dirty grey colour suited well to the nature of the terrain we were moving on. Each of us had a machine gun, a bayonet and 3 grenades. In our pockets we stuffed gags, bandages, ropes and food for 3 days. Before Savannah, east of Lower Kilmarnock, we walked first through a narrow valley, then followed a forest path up the slope of Savannah to its very summit. We were not far from the state border. There, in a shallow track, we crouched under a fir tree and began to gaze at the horizon. The tops of the mountains seemed to rest against the grey sky. The battalion commander pulled out a map and clarified the orientation of the terrain. To the left was darkened mountain Petrozinska. Its Czechoslovak half is called Javorina, dissected into many small ridges. The small warfare waged in these close mountains is won by cunning and dexterity. Every rustle can be heard far away here, the battalion commander warned us. Sohor put binoculars to his eyes and began to scour the terrain metre by metre. Suddenly the binoculars froze. A quarter of an hour passed, and Sohor in his camouflage coat lay motionless in one place among the snow-covered glade. Half an hour passed, and Sohor, as if petrified, did not move. Now an hour had passed. We were gnashing our teeth against the cold, but Sohor remained silent. He stared dazedly ahead, and if he had not been lying on his belly with his head up, he would have been a corpse. When the next half an hour had passed, we had had enough of this. At last Sohor took a deep breath, crawled back a little, and stood up heavily. "Better stiff than dead," he said with a smile. He looked round for a place suitable for a hidden front crossing. Sohor said he looked in that direction for a long time until he noticed something suspicious. He felt as if someone was about to jump on his neck. From that moment on, he didn't care how long he lay in the snow. Time dragged on for a languidly long time. Finally, the suspicious shadow disappeared somewhere. It was uncomfortable to think what would have happened if Sohor had turned his back to the enemy an hour ago. Someone had lost their nerve. Someone had lost the battle with patience. This deceptive path they would take no more. Sohor found another. The dusk thickened. Night had fallen. We crawled out of our hiding place and crept through the sparse shrubbery to a stream running through no man's land. Our white figures against the snow-covered ground could not be distinguished even at a distance of a few paces. We lay in a tight charm, Sappers Havak and Berda in front, behind them, Sohor and the others. The column was closed by Sergeant Vasil Ballo. He was a talented scout who could move stealthily like no one else. Sohor knew his value. We began to cautiously creep forward. Behind the stream there was a minefield. Worked our sappers. They silently and deftly probed the snow, sensitive fingers cleared mines, diffused them, and stacked them on the sides of the road. Bala, who was closing the column, lightly covered the mines with snow, masking our work. From time to time the sappers, tired of their work, put their frostbitten fingertips into their mouths and warmed them with hot breath. Very slowly, literally centimetre by centimetre, we crawled forward. Sometimes we stopped for a few minutes, and then began to move forward again on the white snow. It was pitch black. We could barely distinguish the snowy, shimmering surface only for a few metres around us. Beyond that there was a black wall of darkness. After passing the field, we found ourselves in the forest. There was no sound. The forest through which we were sneaking was filled with some terrible silence. About a kilometre into the forest we settled down to rest. Everyone was silent. No one was even whispering. The sky was covered with clouds, but where the moon was, the darkness lessened a little. Sohor moved nimbly between the bushes, and I could see him trying to memorize landmarks to find his way back. There was a lot of snow in the forest, with pine needles sticking out of it here and there. Sohor was careful to make sure that none of us stepped on the untouched snow. He walked ahead, a little crouched down, listening and looking into the darkness of the night. Yes, this man knew how to walk in the woods. From the place where we had crossed the stream, we had already travelled a considerable distance. Suddenly a light shone through the darkness. We lay down in the snow. It was a gatehouse, which was 2 kilometres away from Prikroy. A fire was burning inside the gatehouse, and a sentry was walking outside. As mesmerized, we looked at the light and mentally imagined Germans in heated huts. They are warming their arses, cattle, and we are freezing here. Berda said quietly with bile in his voice. Yes, if only we had a Christmas tree. It would be Christmas, said Tumek, but Sohor quickly. We had to make a long detour around the German-occupied Prikroy. We cautiously crossed a bare stretch of terrain and began to climb up the steep slope to Hertsuvata. We were already thoroughly tired and had only travelled half the way. At the crest of the mountain, Sohor stopped and listened. At that time, the outline of a figure appeared through the darkness, and in a minute a man appeared. The partisans were waiting at the agreed place. Now we went faster and more confidently. In an hour we were already above Bodrujal, carefully descended from the mountain, and lay down in the forest near the village. The place was deserted. There were occasional lorries passing along the motorway from Mirolja, but they did not stop in the village. Apparently, the activities of the supply and medical services in Bodruzal had already been terminated. We climbed into a barn that stood on the edge of the village, and through the gaps between the logs we watched the street. There was no movement. Dead silence. We were in Bodruzal. What next? According to partisan reports, the Germans had left the village back in October. At its northern end, right under Bezimianaya, was the headquarters of the 1st Battalion of the 552nd Grenadier Regiment. Many telephone wires stretched from the dugouts to the top of the mountain. In Prikroy was the command of the battalion. Paraska Zelezniakova's house, the 4th from the barn, housed some kind of headquarters. During the day, 2 junior officers with a group of soldiers were in the house. One remained on duty at night. From time to time a motor car would drive up to the house and an officer would get out of it. Then the officer would be given a horse and he would set off up the mountain. We sat tense, wary, silent. No one even moved. Our faces were frozen in anticipation. We were completely oblivious to the danger. In Sohor's opinion, this was the same mobile task force that the general had told him about when they were sorting out the missions. It would soon become clear. Sohor couldn't get the night guard out of his mind. When planning the operation, he had intended to stay in the village in hiding during the day, study and check the terrain, and take the tongue the next night. Now he changed the plan, determined to seize the opportunity. Tomorrow would be too late, as the general had said. It was past the first hour of the night. If they were lucky, they could be at the creek by 5 o'clock. The most convenient time for such an operation was when the night was winding down and dawn was just around the corner. The sentries are tired, sleep overtakes them, and it's dark all around. You can't see a thing. Vasil, come here, called Sohor Balo, and they both disappeared into the night together with the guide. Behind the barn they turned to the left, slipped past some buildings, and suddenly found themselves in front of a dark hut in which a twisted lamp burned dimly. In the room, bent at a table, sat a German soldier. He was probably writing or reading. At that moment a sentry appeared from round the corner. After standing for a minute, he turned and disappeared. The scouts crawled back a little to get a better look at the entrance. The sentry in a sheepskin coat walked in front of the entrance from the left to the right corner of the house, from time to time stopped, stomped on the spot, and returned to the door. No, so whispered, turning to Ballo. His eyes burned with excitement. A collection point of information. Vasil lay huddled on the ground, all absorbed in his observation. He nodded vigorously in agreement. The scouts crawled away from the house and returned to the barn. Now Sohor knew what to do. "We'll take him in the house," Sohor said in a dry, businesslike manner. "It's up to you now. Work without shooting and without shouting." He looked straight into the eyes of the scout Drasinchak and slowly, stressing each word, gave him a task. "You, Palo, will take care of the sentry so that he does not squeak. Then you will stand in his place. Vasil and I will go for the tongue. The rest of you will engage if necessary. Lightning will ensure success and silence will ensure return." Everyone moved to Ballo's place. Palo crawled to the corner of the house and lay down behind the bushes. When the sentry went in the opposite direction, Palo moved even closer, seeing the sentry with his hands deep in the pockets of his coat, a large oversized helmet on his head, and a rifle over his shoulder, was approaching the fatal corner. Palo made up his mind. As soon as the German reached the corner and turned round, he would leap on him. The sentry approached slowly. Here he was already at the corner, tapped his foot against his leg, turned round and went. Palo, however, did not move. He told later that something kept him from jumping, and it is difficult to convey in words. The rest of the scouts were squatting on the sidelines, ready to rise at any moment. Suddenly voices were heard from the direction of the village. Creaking snow, someone was hurriedly walking. 2 German officers approached the hut and went inside. Palo was lying in the snow a few steps away from the German sentry. Sohor and Vasil, huddled against the fence, watched the lighted window from behind the bushes. The officers leaned over the table, visors of their caps covering their faces. A non-commissioned officer stood frozen at the side. Then one of the officers went to the telephone and began talking to someone. After half an hour, the officers left. We waited for another minute or two. When the sentry at the corner turned and walked slowly backwards, Palo burst out as if he'd been tossed by some unknown force. A moment later, he squeezed a German's throat with terrible force so that he goggled his eyes and opened his mouth. The sentry gesticulated desperately with his hands, sobbed softly, and fell to the ground. Scout Tomek and the 2 sappers immediately ran up to him. They wrapped a rag round the German's head and quickly dragged him into the shed. When he came to his senses, they tied his hands. "Steady," whispered Tomek. The German walked obediently, not resisting at all. Palo pulled the German's helmet over his head, put on a half coat, and continued the interrupted duty in front of the house. Sohor and Vasil entered the house. "Hands up." Sohor said softly. The non-commissioned officer, who was sitting on a chair, turned fearfully towards the door, looked in surprise at the black muzzles of the 2 pistols, and raised his hands. Sohor nodded threateningly towards the door, and as they crossed the threshold, whispered to the German, "Quiet, or we'll finish you off." They led him quickly out into the street. There Palo and Vasil gagged the prisoner so that he would not scream, and dragged him to the barn. Meanwhile, Sohor ran into the house, quickly took the maps and documents lying on the table, threw the German's overcoat over his arm, quietly closed the door behind him, and disappeared into the darkness. All this happened in the space of 2 minutes. In the shed, the non-commissioned officer's hands were tied. Their prisoner turned out to be Ober-Efreiter Hans Schultz. From him, the scouts learned that in the next room at the time of the kidnapping slept his 2 comrades. This was a surprise to Sohor and Vasil. They looked at each other meaningfully and smiled. We travelled back quite quickly, as if on wings. We hurried as fast as possible to get out of the neighbourhood of the village into the field and the forest. There was our salvation. We had to walk through forests and bushes, up and down steep slopes, through gorges and ravines, kilometre after kilometre eastwards to Hertsuvata, and then straight north again and through the minefield to our own. We had a long and difficult road ahead of us. Sohor had foreseen everything, and that in case of failure we'd take a long roundabout way east to the forest near Shertizhnaya. "Listen, Vasil," Sohor said suddenly. "You know, I don't like it. Things have gone too smoothly for us. The prisoners have been quiet. We'd already travelled a fair distance." Ballo leaned over to Sohor and whispered, "We must keep our eyes open. Check their gags and tie them together with one rope, said Soho. The operation indeed went smoothly and according to plan. The lieutenant had an opportunity to carry it out faster and better, and he did not miss it. We were fortunate in that not a single shot rang out and not a drop of blood was spilled. It would take some time for the Germans to unravel the reason for the disappearance of their 2 soldiers. We hoped that this would not happen soon, but in the meantime it was necessary to get as far away from the pursuers as possible. In an hour we planned to be under Herzogewater, and within the next hour to pass through the woods to the gatehouse. No one allowed himself to think of fatigue. We were walking so fast that sometimes we were short of breath. Then we made short stops. Out of 14 kilometers, we had only 4 to go. They seemed like an eternity to us. We could barely drag our legs, which felt like lead. Sweat covered our eyes. I felt as if something was about to burst in my head or in my heart. None of the prisoners, unable to stand the frantic pace, began to stagger from side to side. Vasil freed the prisoner's mouth a little to breathe. We approached the gatehouse. In one place, where there was a lot of snow, we made a small halt in a snowdrift, and that saved us. First we heard the creaking of snow, and then we heard muffled voices. Out of the grey twilight dark figures of German soldiers emerged. As they passed us, Sohor and Tamen looked at each other. The fact was that fragments of conversation had clearly reached their ears. One of the soldiers asked his neighbour, "Did you know Schultz?" It was about our prisoner. No, they were not mistaken and were ready to swear they had heard those words. They had a trained ear for German speech like no one else. So the disappearance of 2 soldiers had been discovered in Bodruzhel, and the command had sounded the alarm at the front. The patrol that had just passed us had obviously been given the task of preventing our reconnaissance group from crossing the front line. Crossing the front line during the day was out of the question. We would have to wait in a safe shelter during daylight hours and cross the front at dusk. "I think we are in a deep puddle," whispered Tomek. "What puddle?" "Everything is going well," said Soho jokingly, as he always did in such cases, and then he was silent again for a long time. It was always like that in moments of danger. We crept through the enemy-guarded positions in the direction of the Yavarin forest, and there, in a deep gorge covered with snow, we decided to wait out the day. The forest was all around us, but now it did not seem so unfriendly. Even the needles were not so sharp. We were somewhere in the neighbourhood of Yaruka. It was already our forest. The gorge was so deep that it seemed to have no bottom. We drove down the precipice and deep into it even deeper. Apparently, the snow beneath us was several meters deep. We were worried that we were not going to get out of here easily. Sohor took off the rags of the Germans and let them breathe. The prisoners looked exhausted. The non-commissioned officer stared at us fearfully. The day passed in tense anticipation. We stared blankly at the snow that filled the gorge. No one spoke a word. I felt so tired and sleepy that I was losing my ability to think. The wet clothes on my back began to freeze, and I was overcome by a single insidious thought. It would be good to cover my eyes for at least a moment. It was a terrible thought. But I was so tired that I was losing control of myself. But at the thought that Sohor might see me sleeping, I woke up and noticed that he was looking at me intently. Sohor looked around at everyone else, and there was concern in his eyes. The short day was quickly coming to an end. Dusk was coming. It was one of the few evenings when, at least for a little while, the setting sun broke through the dense veil of clouds. The gorge remained in shadow, and it seemed as if the trees were reaching greedily for the light, but they were too short. For a little while under the pale, cold sun, the Arucha also shone. The gorge was as silent as it is on a winter morning between opposite trenches before a battle. When it got dark, we set off. It was possible to move further only by crawling. The sappers came forward, making our way through the minefield. When we raised our heads, it seemed to us as if the sappers were lying motionless on the snow. But their dexterous hands were doing their work. Then we were signalled that the way to the creek was clear. We approached the passage and climbed up. At that moment, a long streak of tracer bullets ripped through the thickening darkness on the right. We ran across the creek and dropped into the snow. Shots rang out from the forest and from the slopes. Machine guns rumbled. It was the guys from the 2nd Battalion who opened heavy fire on the enemy side, covering us. But we with the prisoners were already behind the stream, safe. Home, exclaimed Sohor joyfully. It was a fine word. The reconnaissance raid with Sohor to Bodruzal on the 21st of November has always remained in my memory. I admired Sohor. He was really a fine man, and the soldiers loved him. In the most difficult moment, when everyone was losing hope, he believed in success, the only one from the whole group, and that gave everyone strength. This was Soho's last reconnaissance on Dukla. One summer day in 1950, in Prague, Soho and I were sitting in my office, in the office of the head of the higher military school. The main topic of our conversation was not memories of the military past, but the recent crash of a Czechoslovak warplane on which Soho was on board. The plane crashed over the Mimonia airfield. The body of the pilot was found among the remains of the plane, and Soho was also searched for there. But he was not there. It turned out that Soho was alive and well. It was incomprehensible, and many people did not believe in this miracle, and Soho had kept himself alive by his fantastic cold-bloodedness. In a split second, he realized that he had a definite chance to save himself. He told me the following at the time. I was flying with the pilot over the area of a military training camp. The aeroplane suddenly went into a corkscrew. All the pilot's efforts to level the machine were in vain. I knew how it was going to end. We were in the plane without parachutes and were flying at a height of 400. I made an instant decision. If I stayed in the plane, the end was known. If I jumped out, there was a chance of falling on the tent and surviving, although it was a 1 in a million chance. The decision was made lightning fast, and without a second's hesitation I jumped out. At that moment the plane was about 200 meters high and was inevitably falling downwards. I fell on the tent, so that before I hit the hard ground the stretched tarpaulin threw me up twice. On medical examination I was found to have no fractures or internal injuries. I was treated for a few abrasions and was soon back to my regular work. Lieutenant Colonel Antonin Soho told his story as simply as if he were buying a bun in a shop. Shortly afterwards, he was killed in a car crash. A military driver pulling out of the side of the motorway crashed into Soho's personal car. Hero of the Soviet Union Antonin Soho was severely injured and died a few hours later.